The silence in the sanctuary was a fragile, sacred thing. It was woven from the scent of old wood and lemon polish, the soft rustle of Sunday best, and the expectant hush of 200 souls turned toward the pulpit. Sunlight, filtered through the stained glass depiction of the Good Samaritan, painted the pews in jeweled tones of ruby and sapphire. In this space, every breath felt like a prayer, and it was into this sacred silence that Marcus chose to detonate his world. Ilara felt the shift before it happened, a subtle change in the air around their shared space on the polished oak pew. The warmth from her husband's shoulder had been replaced by a coiled, predatory stillness. She kept her eyes fixed on Pastor David, whose gentle voice was weaving a tapestry of grace and forgiveness, but her senses were screaming. Marcus was a man who loved an audience, and for the past few months his cruelty had been metastasizing, seeking ever larger stages. She had thought, naively, that the house of God would be a sanctuary. She was wrong. It was to be his grandest theater yet. He moved with a speed that was shocking in its viciousness. One moment his hand was resting on his knee, the next it was a claw in her hair. She didn't have time to cry out. His fingers tangled in the delicate lace front of her wig, a piece she wore not for vanity, but to cover the thinning patches of hair that had fallen out from the slow, corrosive stress of her marriage. He yanked. The sound, a sickening rip of Velcro and lace, tore through the pastor's sermon. A collective gasp, sharp and unified, swept through the congregation. Time seemed to splinter into 1,000 glittering shards of horror. Ilara felt a phantom chill on her exposed scalp, a profound, soul-deep nakedness that had nothing to do with the air temperature. Her hands flew to her head by instinct, but it was too late. The wig, a cascade of soft, honey-blonde curls that she had chosen with such care, was in Marcus's hand. He held it aloft like a trophy. His face was a mask of triumphant cruelty. A slow, smug smile spread across his lips as he turned, his eyes scanning the pews. He found who he was looking for 3 rows back, Chloe. Her face, a canvas of cheap surprise and delight, was angled toward him. With a theatrical flourish, Marcus extended his arm and presented the wig to her. "A gift," he mouthed, his voice a poisonous whisper that still carried in the stunned silence. "For the one who deserves it." Chloe, his mistress, a woman whose existence was an open secret he had stopped bothering to hide, giggled, a high, tinkling sound that shattered the last vestiges of sanctuary. She reached out and took the wig, her fingers stroking the synthetic hair as if it were a prize she had won. The congregation was frozen, a gallery of gaping mouths and wide, unblinking eyes. They were witnesses to a desecration, not just of a marriage, but of a woman's dignity in the one place she should have been safe. Ilara sat perfectly still. The world had narrowed to a roaring in her ears. She could feel hundreds of eyes on her, a weight of pity and morbid curiosity. But through the roaring, one thing became clear. This was not an ending. This was a beginning. Marcus, in his spectacular arrogance, thought he had delivered the final, crushing blow. He believed he had stripped her of her last shred of pride. He didn't know that what he had actually stripped away were her last reasons for restraint. He had handed her a declaration of war, unaware that she was already a general, standing silently before a fully armed and waiting legion. He thought he had taken a wig. He didn't know he had just signed his own surrender. Within a week, everything he believed was his would be gone, and the world he had built on her foundations would crumble to dust. We're about to watch a tower of arrogance fall. If you believe that dignity is the ultimate armor, and that justice, though sometimes slow, is always worth the wait, then you're in the right place. Do us a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. And let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's get back to the moment it all began. The morning had started with a lie, as most of their mornings did. Ilara stood before the vanity in their cavernous, minimalist bathroom, the one she had designed with clean lines and natural light to be a space of peace. It no longer was. Her reflection showed a woman of quiet composure, her features elegant but etched with a weariness that her makeup could not entirely conceal. She carefully adjusted the wig, settling it into place. It had become a piece of armor, a way to present a facade of wholeness to a world that did not need to know the battles she fought in private. "Are you wearing that thing again?" Marcus's voice, thick with sleep and condescension, came from the bedroom doorway. He leaned against the frame, a silk robe hanging open over his sculpted chest. He saw himself as a Roman emperor, and their sprawling, glass-walled house as his palace. He conveniently forgot that she was the architect who had designed it and the silent partner whose investments had paid for it. "Good morning to you too, Marcus," Elara said, her voice even. She met his gaze in the mirror. His eyes, the color of cold coffee, held their usual assessment of her, a catalog of her perceived failings. "It makes you look matronly," he said, waving a dismissive hand. "Chloe says women only wear wigs when they've given up." He delivered the line with casual cruelty, a conversational jab meant to wound. He had been mentioning Chloe's name more and more, using it as a weapon to chip away at Elara's composure. Elara's fingers paused on the clasp of her pearl necklace. She thought of the small, leather-bound journal in her handbag. Inside, amidst sketches for a new community library, was a meticulously kept ledger. It wasn't just a diary, it was a record. Every casual insult, every financial sleight of hand, every time he'd taken credit for her work, it was all there, dated and noted in her precise architectural script. That journal was the foundation of the new life she was building, brick by painful brick. "I'm not interested in Chloe's opinions," she said, her voice soft but firm. It was a tone she had perfected, the quiet bomb. A statement that seemed simple, but carried the devastating implication that his mistress, and by extension his judgment, were irrelevant. He bristled. Her refusal to rise to his bait was a constant source of frustration for him. He wanted tears, shouting, a dramatic scene. She gave him only calm, infuriating dignity. "You should be," he sneered, pushing off the doorframe and walking toward her. He stood behind her, his reflection looming over hers in the mirror. "She's vibrant, she's fun, she's not weighed down." He gestured vaguely at Elara's simple, elegant dress. Weighed down. Elara felt a bitter smile touch her lips, though she didn't let it show. Oh, she was weighed down. Weighed down by the mortgage on this house, which was solely in her name. Weighed down by the quarterly payments to his investors for the lifestyle brand he was running into the ground, all funded from her private accounts. Weighed down by the knowledge that the man who looked at her with such disdain was a hollow shell, propped up entirely by the woman he despised. "It's time for church, Marcus," she said, turning away from the mirror and from him. She picked up her handbag from the marble countertop. Her fingers brushed against the smooth leather of the journal inside. A jolt of strength, of purpose, went through her. Patience. It was a structural principle, in architecture and in life. You had to wait for the foundation to set before you could build the walls. Her foundation was nearly cured. As she walked out of the bathroom, he called after her, "Try to look happy today, will you? People are starting to talk. It reflects badly on me." The irony was so thick it was almost suffocating. It reflects badly on me. He had no idea. The storm was coming, and he was complaining about a cloud. As she waited for him by the front door, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn she paid for, she made a decision. She had been waiting for the right moment, for a sign that her plan for a quiet, orderly separation was the correct path. She had wanted to dismantle their life together with minimal collateral damage. But his escalating cruelty, his sheer, blatant disrespect, was a sign of a different kind. Perhaps a quiet dismantling wasn't enough. Perhaps some structures are so rotten they don't deserve to be dismantled. They need to be demolished. The history of their marriage was a study in architectural decay. What had begun as a promising structure built on what Alara believed was a shared foundation of love and ambition, had slowly revealed its hidden flaws. They had met in college. He was the charismatic president of the business fraternity, all dazzling smiles and bold proclamations about the empire he would one day build. She was the quiet, brilliant student at the School of Architecture, the one whose models were so innovative they were displayed in the university's main hall. He was drawn to her talent, her calm center, her unassuming grace. He saw it not as something to cherish, but as something to acquire, a beautiful, functional asset for his future portfolio. In the early years, his ambition had seemed charming. He was a whirlwind of ideas, a master of networking. Ilara, meanwhile, was methodical. She finished her licensure, took a position at a prestigious firm, and began to build a reputation for designs that were not just beautiful, but deeply human. She specialized in sustainable, community-oriented projects, libraries that felt like living rooms, health clinics that felt like homes, public parks that fostered connection. Her work won awards, but she never sought the spotlight. She found fulfillment in the work itself, in the quiet knowledge of a job well done. Marcus's ventures, however, never quite launched. His ideas were grand but lacked substance. His networking resulted in many handshakes, but few contracts. He was a magnificent facade with no structural support. As Alara's career quietly soared, his floundered. And that was when the erosion began. It started subtly. He'd borrow her language to sound more intelligent in meetings. He'd present her concepts for community integration as his own business philosophy. He began to see her success not as a shared victory, but as a personal affront. The first major crack appeared 5 years into their marriage, with the introduction of his mother, Beatrice. Beatrice was a woman cast from the same mold as her son, obsessed with status, blinded by arrogance. From their first meeting, she viewed Ilara with suspicion. Ilara's quiet nature was misinterpreted as weakness, her humility as a lack of ambition. In Beatrice's eyes, her brilliant son, Marcus, had married beneath him. "She's a sweet girl, I suppose," Beatrice had said to Marcus once, loud enough for Ilara to hear from the next room. "But so plain. Are you sure she's the right partner to help you build your brand? You need a show pony, darling, not a workhorse." The comment stung, but Ilara buried the hurt. She tried to win Beatrice over, hosting elegant family dinners, remembering birthdays, offering her architectural skills to help redesign Beatrice's dated kitchen. Nothing worked. Every success of Ilara's was minimized. Every achievement of Marcus's, no matter how small or fabricated, was magnified. He was the sun, she was a pale, orbiting moon. And Marcus, instead of defending his wife, basked in his mother's adoration. It fed his starving ego. He began to adopt Beatrice's view of Ilara. She wasn't his partner, she was his support staff. The money she earned wasn't their money, it was a resource for him to use for his projects. He quit his last real job to launch Aurelian Lifestyles, a vaguely defined luxury brand that, in reality, consisted of an expensive office, a glossy website, and zero revenue. It was all funded by Ilara. She had let him. In the beginning, it was out of love, a desire to see him happy and fulfilled. Then, it was out of a weary sense of obligation, a hope that if he just got this one win, he would soften. He would become the man she thought she had married. But with every wire transfer she approved, he grew more entitled, more condescending. Her generosity was not a gift, it was his due. He lived in the house she designed and owned, drove the car she paid for, and wore the clothes purchased with her money, all while criticizing her for not being good enough for him. The stress began to take a physical toll. Her hair, once thick and lustrous, began to thin at the crown. It was a manifestation of her spirit, slowly withering under the constant barrage of criticism and disrespect. The wig was a practical solution, but it became another tool for his cruelty. It was a visible symbol of a vulnerability he could exploit. Her journal became her true sanctuary. Late at night, after he was asleep, she would sit in her study, the one room in the house that felt entirely hers, and she would write. She documented the transactions, printing out bank statements and tucking them between the pages. She sketched out new designs for projects she was pitching under her own name, through a separate LLC she had formed years ago, a prescient act of self-preservation. And she planned. Her plan was simple, at first, a quiet divorce. She would let him keep the Aurelian brand, even give him a generous severance to start a new life, as long as he walked away without a fight. She wanted to preserve his dignity, not for his sake, but for hers. She didn't want a war. But then came Chloe. Chloe was everything Beatrice had wanted for her son, a show pony. She was a young, vapid influencer whose only talent was for self-promotion. Marcus was utterly infatuated. He started being careless, leaving receipts from expensive dinners on his desk, letting texts with heart emojis flash on his phone screen. He wanted Elara to know. He was flaunting his infidelity, daring her to react. He saw her stoicism not as strength, but as proof that she was a passionless, cold woman who wouldn't even fight for her own husband. He had no idea she was simply gathering evidence. The affair was just one more line item in the ledger, one more brick in the wall of her new life. One more reason that demolition, not dismantling, was the only answer. The dinner party was Beatrice's idea. It was an annual affair, a gathering of what she called the right people. Wealthy, well-connected friends who moved in the same self-satisfied circles as she and Marcus. For Elara, it was an annual ordeal. This year was worse. It was 3 weeks before the incident at the church, and the tension in their home was a palpable, living thing. Chloe was no longer a secret, but a constant, looming presence in their marriage. Beatrice greeted Elara at the door of her sprawling, ostentatiously decorated home with a kiss that didn't quite land on her cheek. "Elara, darling," she said, her eyes sweeping over Elara's simple, impeccably tailored black dress. "You look comfortable." It was her signature brand of insult, wrapped in the thinnest veneer of politeness. Marcus, already holding a glass of scotch, preened beside his mother. He had spent the afternoon regaling Elara with his plans to hold court tonight, to finally secure funding from an old family friend, a property developer named Mr. Harrison. The evening unfolded like a play Elara had seen too many times. She circulated with a polite smile, engaging in conversations that felt like wading through mud. The talk was all of money, of acquisitions, of summer homes in the Hamptons. It was a world she could have easily dominated had she chosen to reveal the true scale of her success. But she remained quiet, playing the part of the supportive, unassuming wife. She found herself standing near the grand fireplace, listening as Mr. Harrison, a portly man with a booming voice, held forth on the decline of modern architecture. "No soul anymore," he declared. "Just glass boxes. No connection to the community, to the people who have to live with them." Before Elara could respond, Marcus stepped smoothly into the conversation, placing a proprietary hand on the small of her back. "That's exactly what I've been saying, Charles," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "My whole philosophy with Aurelian lifestyles is about creating integrated living. It's not just about luxury, it's about building a narrative, a community. We need to think about structures as living organisms, breathing with the people they serve." Elara froze. He was quoting her, verbatim. It was a line from a proposal she had written just last week for a low-income housing project, a passion project she had been developing for months. She had read it aloud to him one evening, seeking his opinion in a foolish, lingering moment of hope that they could still connect over shared ideas. He had seemed distracted, barely listening. Clearly, he had listened just enough. Mr. Harrison looked impressed. "Well said, son, well said. A living organism. I like that. You have a good head on your shoulders." "He has a brilliant mind," Beatrice cooed, gliding over to join them. She beamed at Marcus, then gave Ilara a look that was pure dismissal, as if Ilara were a piece of furniture. Ilara felt a familiar, hot surge of anger, but she pushed it down, compressing it into a cold, hard diamond of resolve. She smiled faintly. She reached into her evening bag and her fingers found the cool, smooth cover of her small journal. It was always with her, a talisman, a promise to herself. She excused herself from the group, murmuring something about freshening up. In the powder room, with its gaudy gold swan faucets, she leaned against the marble counter and took a steadying breath. She didn't look in the mirror. She didn't want to see the hurt in her own eyes. Instead, she took out the journal in a slim, elegant pen. She flipped to a clean page and wrote, October 14th, dinner at Beatrice's. M claimed my living organism design philosophy as his own in conversation with C. Harrison. It was a simple entry, clinical, but writing it down was an act of reclamation. He could steal her words, but he couldn't steal the credit from the permanent record she was building. As she put the journal away, her eyes fell on her own reflection. The woman looking back at her was not weak. Her gaze was clear, her jaw set. The humiliation was a fire, and it was forging her patience into steel. She returned to the party just as dessert was being served. As she passed the terrace, she saw Marcus in close conversation with a young woman in a garish red dress. It was Chloe. He had invited his mistress to his mother's party. Chloe was laughing, her head thrown back, one hand resting possessively on Marcus's arm. Beatrice was nearby, watching them with an approving smile. This was the show pony. This was the woman she deemed worthy of her son. Ilara didn't change her expression. She didn't cause a scene. She simply registered the fact. Another entry for the journal. Another nail in the coffin of her marriage. She walked past them without a glance, took a seat at the dining table, and began to eat her creme brulee with a steady hand. She was no longer just an architect of buildings. She was the architect of Marcus's downfall, and she would design it with the same meticulous, unsparing precision she brought to all her projects. The demolition phase was getting closer. The week leading up to that final Sunday was a masterclass in psychological warfare. Marcus, buoyed by the perceived success of the dinner party and the brazen introduction of Chloe into their social sphere, became insufferable. He moved through their home not like a husband, but like a lord of the manor on the verge of ousting a tiresome tenant. He was preparing for a new life and didn't feel the need to be subtle about it. He took phone calls with Chloe in the living room, his voice a low, intimate murmur, punctuated by laughter. He left a receipt for a diamond bracelet on the kitchen island, not hidden, but placed squarely in the center, a deliberate provocation. He started referring to the future in the singular. When I redecorate this place, or my next trip to Milan, it was a constant, grinding effort to erase her from the picture. Ilara observed it all with a preternatural calm that drove him to greater and greater acts of audacity. Her silence was a vacuum, and he felt compelled to fill it with noise and arrogance. He mistook her lack of reaction for capitulation. He thought she was beaten, a deflated figurehead in a life he was already commandeering. But Ilara was not idle. Her quietness was the hum of a powerful engine running at full capacity. On Tuesday, she had a 2-hour lunch meeting. Marcus assumed it was with one of her charity committees. It was with Daniel Sterling, the most feared forensic accountant in the city. In a quiet corner of a discreet restaurant, she opened her journal. It was no longer just a ledger of insults. It was an organized dossier. She walked him through the labyrinth of shell corporations and personal accounts, showing him exactly how her income had been systematically siphoned to fund Aurelian lifestyles and Marcus's personal extravagances. Sterling, a man with ice water in his veins, listened, his expression grim. "He's been extraordinarily reckless," he said, looking at a summary she had prepared. "He's built a house of cards on your foundation, and he seems to think he owns the land." I want to reclaim the land, the foundation, and the house, Ilara stated, her voice devoid of emotion. I don't want to negotiate, I want to execute. Execution it is, Sterling replied with a thin smile. The paperwork will be ready to file by Monday morning. On Thursday, she met with her lawyer, a sharp, empathetic woman named Maria Reyes. They didn't meet in an office. Instead, they walked through the construction site of Ilara's latest project, a state-of-the-art pediatric care facility. As they navigated around stacks of drywall and coils of wire, Ilara laid out the final pieces of her strategy. The house, the cars, the brokerage accounts, the shares in Aurelian. It's all tied to my personal holding company, Ilara explained, pointing to a blueprint. He has signatory authority on some business accounts, which he has clearly abused, but he has no ownership. He is, for all legal purposes, a long-term guest. Maria nodded, impressed. You've been preparing for this for a long time. I believe in good foundations, Ilara said simply. He thinks our marriage is the foundation. He's wrong. My self-respect is. And he has systematically tried to demolish it. The only thing he's accomplished is proving the original structure was unsound. The conversation turned to the wig. Maria had noticed it before, but had been too polite to ask. Ilara explained, her voice clinical, about the stress-induced alopecia. It started about 3 years ago, when he began the affair and the financial recklessness escalated. My doctor said my cortisol levels were through the roof. Maria's face hardened. Ilara, this isn't just infidelity. This is abuse, emotional, financial, and it's had a physical manifestation. That's important. I know, Ilara said, looking up at the steel skeleton of the building rising against the sky. It's become his favorite weapon, a symbol of my weakness. He doesn't understand that symbols can be turned against you. That Saturday, the day before the church incident, the atmosphere in the house was thick with an unspoken finality. It was the quiet before the storm. Marcus was giddy, almost manic. He had a long, celebratory phone call with his mother, Beatrice. Ilara, sitting in the adjoining room, heard snippets. Everything is falling into place, Mother. A new chapter. She'll finally understand her position. He believed Mr. Harrison was ready to invest in his company. He believed Ilara was finally broken. He believed that tomorrow, in front of the entire congregation, he would perform the ultimate act of dominance, cementing his new status and publicly humiliating the woman who was a weight on his ambitions. That evening, as Ilara prepared for bed, she looked at the honey blonde wig resting on its stand. It looked so lifelike, so soft. For so long it had been a source of shame, a secret she carried. But now she saw it differently. It was bait, and she knew with a chilling certainty that Marcus was going to take it. She felt no fear, only a profound, cleansing sense of resolution. He was about to start a fire, thinking he would burn her to the ground, completely unaware that she was standing in a fireproof fortress of her own making, holding the deed to the very land on which he stood. The demolition was scheduled for sunrise. The interior of Grace Chapel was designed for reverence. High, arching beams drew the eye upward toward heaven. The acoustics carried the pastor's voice to the furthest corner, making his words feel both communal and deeply personal. It was a space Ilara had always loved, a place of quiet contemplation. Today it was a courtroom, and the congregation, the jury. As Pastor David's sermon on the prodigal son reached its gentle crescendo, Ilara felt the familiar prickle of awareness. Marcus was vibrating with a malevolent energy beside her. She could feel the stares from 3 rows back, where Chloe sat next to an empty space, a space Chloe clearly believed would soon be filled by Marcus. Beatrice, seated on Marcus's other side, wore a look of smug anticipation. They were a united front of malice. Then it happened. The swift, brutal motion, the rip of lace, the sudden, shocking cold on her scalp. The collective gasp was a physical force, sucking the air from the room. 200 faces turned toward her, a sea of shock, pity, and a grim, undeniable fascination. Pastor David's words faltered and died on his lips. He stared from the pulpit, his kind face a mask of disbelief and horror. In that frozen moment, Alara did not cry. She did not scream. She did not try to cover her head. She simply sat, her back ramrod straight, her chin held high. She let them look. She let them see the thinning hair, the physical evidence of the private war she had been fighting. She let them see the raw, unvarnished truth. Her vulnerability, exposed under the holy light of the stained glass windows, became a strange kind of power. It was an indictment. Marcus, high on his own cruelty, held the wig aloft. His smile was predatory. He turned, his movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. He was the conquering hero. He presented the wig to Chloe, his offering, his symbol of transfer. A gift, his whisper slithering through the silence, for the one who deserves it. Chloe's giggle was the sound of a shattering window pane. It broke the spell of silent horror, replacing it with a wave of murmurs and scandalized whispers. She took the wig, her expression one of greedy triumph. She had won. The old queen was deposed. The new one was being crowned with the spoils of her humiliation. But then, a different sound cut through the noise. A deep, resonant voice, filled with an authority that had nothing to do with arrogance and everything to do with righteous anger. Marcus. It was Pastor David. He had stepped down from the pulpit and was walking slowly, deliberately, down the central aisle. His face was no longer just kind. It was thunderous. The gentle shepherd was gone, replaced by a guardian of the flock, and one of his sheep had been savaged by a wolf in his own pasture. Marcus turned, his smile faltering slightly. He had expected the pastor to be flustered, to perhaps call for decorum. He did not expect this direct, personal confrontation. "Pastor," he said, attempting a dismissive tone, "just a small domestic matter." "There is nothing small about what you have just done," Pastor David said, his voice ringing with power. He did not raise it, but it filled the sanctuary, silencing every whisper. He stopped a few feet from their pew. He did not look at Marcus. His eyes, full of a profound and aching sorrow, were on Alara. He saw her. He didn't see a victim. He saw a woman of immense strength, a pillar holding strong against a hurricane. He saw the quiet dignity she had carried into his church for years. He saw the weariness she tried to hide. And in that moment, he understood what many in the congregation had chosen to ignore: the long, slow cruelty she had endured. Alara met his gaze. In his eyes, she saw not pity, but respect and validation. It was the final piece of confirmation she needed. Slowly, gracefully, she stood up. She smoothed the front of her dress. She did not look at Marcus. She did not look at Chloe. She looked only at the altar at the front of the church, at the cross that hung there. Then she turned and began to walk down the aisle, toward the exit. The congregation parted for her like the Red Sea. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was heavy with shame and regret. The people who had watched her private pain become a public spectacle could not meet her eyes. Her dignified, silent exit was more powerful than any scream, any accusation. It was a verdict. As she reached the heavy oak doors, she paused. She turned her head, not to look back at the wreckage of her marriage, but to look at Pastor David. She gave him a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a signal, a transfer of trust. He understood. She pushed open the doors and stepped out into the bright, indifferent sunshine, leaving the ruins of her old life behind her. The demolition was complete. Now the reconstruction could begin. The moment Alara stepped out of the church, the heavy oak doors swinging shut behind her, the atmosphere inside curdled. The sacred silence had been replaced by a toxic, judgmental hush. Marcus was left standing, his arms still half extended, the triumphant smirk on his face dissolving into confusion, and then a flicker of unease. He had anticipated tears. hysterics, a satisfyingly dramatic breakdown. Ilara's quiet, dignified departure had stolen his climax. The audience was no longer looking at him with awe, but with a dawning sense of revulsion. Pastor David broke the silence. His gaze, hard as granite, finally fell upon Marcus. "You will come with me, now," he commanded. It was not a request. He then turned his head slightly, his eyes finding Chloe, who was still holding the wig as if it were a hot coal. "You too." His voice was cold. Then he addressed the congregation, his voice regaining its pastoral resonance, but laced with a new, steely tone. "My brothers and sisters, you have just witnessed a profound act of cruelty and desecration in God's house. I ask you to pray. Pray for the victim of this shameful display, and pray for the souls of those who would commit such an act. Service is over. Go in peace and reflect on what you have seen." There was a stunned, shuffling sound as people began to rise, their whispers a low hum of bees in a disturbed hive. Beatrice rushed to her son's side, her face pale with fury. "David, how dare you?" she hissed. "This is a family matter. You are overstepping." "Beatrice," the pastor said, his voice dangerously low, "you will either be silent or you will leave my church. What happens here is no longer just a family matter, it is a moral one." He turned and strode toward the vestry, the small room behind the altar, fully expecting to be followed. Marcus, flustered and stripped of his audience, hesitated. But the sheer force of the pastor's will was undeniable. With a look of utter bewilderment, he followed. Chloe, looking terrified, scurried after him, dropping the wig onto the pew as if it were cursed. Beatrice, her face a mask of indignation, marched behind her son, ready to defend him. Meanwhile, Ilara was not collapsing in her car. She was not weeping. She sat in the driver's seat of her modest, practical sedan, a car Marcus often mocked, and took out her phone. She made 2 calls. The first was to Daniel Sterling, the forensic accountant. "It's done," she said, her voice clear and steady. "File it." The second call was to Maria Reyes, her lawyer. "He did it. It was public. There were 200 witnesses. Are we ready?" "We've been ready for months, Ilara." Maria's voice came back, warm and resolute. "The injunctions will be served tomorrow morning. He'll be barred from the house, the office, and from accessing any of the accounts. By noon, he'll be legally and financially neutered." "Thank you, Maria," Ilara said. A single tear, not of sorrow but of profound relief, traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away. It was the only one she would shed. She started the car and drove away, not toward the cold, empty house she had designed, but toward a new beginning. Back in the vestry, the air was thick with tension. Pastor David stood behind his small, cluttered desk, his presence filling the tiny room. Marcus, attempting to regain his swagger, adopted a belligerent stance. "I don't appreciate being frog-marched back here like a schoolboy, Pastor. Ilara is my wife. She's been overwrought for months. I simply made a point." "A point?" Pastor David's voice was incredulous. He looked from Marcus's defiant face to Chloe's terrified one, to Beatrice's furious glare. "You sought to destroy a woman's spirit in front of her community. You used this sacred place as a stage for your depravity. What point were you trying to make, Marcus? That you are a man of power? Or that you are a coward who attacks a person you perceive to be weaker than you?" "She is weak," Beatrice spat. "She's a drain on him. She's passionless, cold. She deserved a wake-up call." The pastor held up a hand, silencing her. "I have known Ilara for 10 years, Beatrice. I have seen her lead fundraisers that built the new wing of our community center. I have seen her quietly pay the utility bills for struggling families in this congregation. I have seen her donate her time and extraordinary talent to design the new homeless shelter, pro bono. The woman you call weak and cold has more strength and warmth in her little finger than you and your son have displayed in your entire lives." This was news to Marcus and Beatrice. They knew Ilara did charity work, but they had dismissed it as a hobby. They had no idea of the scale, of the respect she commanded outside the narrow, gilded cage they had built for her. The pastor's eyes then fell on Chloe. "And you," he said, his voice softening with a note of pity, "you allowed yourself to be a weapon in his cruel game. Do you feel proud, holding the trophy of another woman's humiliation?" Chloe burst into tears. "I didn't," he said. "I thought it was a joke," she stammered, looking at Marcus for support. But Marcus was staring at the pastor, his mind reeling from the revelations about Alara's activities. "It was not a joke, Marcus. It was the last stone you will be allowed to throw," the pastor said, his voice turning prophetic. He leaned forward, his hands flat on his desk. "I went to see Alara yesterday. She knew you were planning something like this. She told me she was at a crossroads. She could continue to endure, or she could choose to be free." He paused, letting the words sink in. "After what you did today, I believe she has made her choice. And I want you to know, when the consequences of that choice arrive, you will not find a sanctuary in my church. You will find a house of judgment. Now get out." He pointed to the door. His authority was absolute. Beatrice, for the first time, looked truly shaken. Marcus, his face ashen, turned and walked out, his arrogance finally punctured. Chloe fled after him. Beatrice gave the pastor one last, venomous look before following her son, the three of them a retreating parade of disgrace. Pastor David sat down heavily in his chair. The anger drained out of him, leaving a deep sadness. He looked at the small wooden cross on his desk. He had just declared war on one of his wealthiest, most influential families, but he felt no regret. He had stood up for the quietest, most dignified member of his flock. He picked up his phone and called Alara. She answered on the second ring. "Are you all right, my child?" he asked gently. "I am more than all right, Pastor," her voice came through, calm and clear as a bell. "I am free." The meeting was set for Wednesday, 3 days after the church incident. It was not called a meeting, but a session of reconciliation, a term chosen by Pastor David with deliberate, piercing irony. He had summoned Marcus, Beatrice, and Chloe to the church's fellowship hall, a large, airy room with polished floors and a wall of windows overlooking a garden. He had told them it was a necessary step toward healing and forgiveness, a chance to mediate a path forward with Alara. Marcus and Beatrice arrived with their lawyer in tow, a man with a shark-like smile named Mr. Jennings. They had spent the last 3 days in a state of confused rage. Marcus had been served with the legal papers on Monday morning. A stoic process server had handed him the thick envelope as he was leaving for his office. He had been barred from the house, his corporate credit cards were declined, and the locks on his Aurelian Lifestyles office had been changed. He was in a state of shock, unable to comprehend the speed and totality of his dispossession. He and his mother were staying in a suite at a luxury hotel, a bill he was quickly realizing he had no way to pay. They came to the meeting believing it was their chance to fight back. They saw Alara as having thrown a hysterical tantrum, and they assumed Pastor David, in his naivety, would try to talk her down. They believed they still held the power, that this was all a dramatic but temporary setback. Chloe was also there, looking pale and nervous, having been convinced by Marcus that her testimony against Alara's coldness was crucial. They were all seated around a large, circular oak table when the door opened. Alara entered. The transformation was breathtaking. She was not the subdued, weary woman they were used to. She wore a tailored suit of cobalt blue that radiated confidence. Her hair was not covered. It was styled into a chic, elegant crop that accentuated her high cheekbones and made her look younger, fiercer. She was not just surviving, she was thriving. The armor of the wig was gone, replaced by the unapologetic armor of her true self. She was not alone. Behind her walked her lawyer, Maria Reyes, and the forensic accountant, Daniel Sterling. They carried sleek leather briefcases. They were not here for reconciliation. They were here for a surrender. Alara took a seat directly opposite Marcus. She looked at him, her gaze level and unreadable. "Hello, Marcus," she said, her voice calm and clear. Marcus sneered, trying to recover his footing. "Well, well, look what the cat dragged in. Quite the performance, Elara. Are you done with your little drama? Are you ready to come home and act like a wife?" Mr. Jennings, the lawyer, cleared his throat. "My client is prepared to be magnanimous. We can discuss a reconciliation agreement, provided certain theatrical tendencies are curbed." Elara didn't even glance at him. Her focus was entirely on Marcus. She placed her leather-bound journal on the table in front of her. It looked small and unassuming next to the lawyer's bulky briefcases. "I'm not here to reconcile, Marcus. I'm here to present the terms of your departure from my life." She opened the journal. "I believe in being thorough, so I've made a list." Pastor David, seated at the head of the table, leaned forward slightly. This was the moral mirror he had been waiting for. "Let's start 5 years ago," Elara began, her voice even, almost conversational. "June 12th, you borrowed $300,000 from our joint savings account to fund the initial launch of Aurelian Lifestyles. You told me it was a loan. You never paid it back. The account, by the way, was funded entirely from my salary and bonuses." Daniel Sterling slid a folder across the table to Mr. Jennings. "Exhibit A, bank statements and transfer receipts." Marcus's face began to lose its color. "That was seed money, an investment in our future." "Our future?" Elara's voice held a note of genuine curiosity. "That's interesting, because on September 3rd of that same year, at a dinner with the Wilsons, you introduced my design for the waterfront park as your own conceptual project. You used my success to bolster your image while spending my money." She turned a page in her journal. "Let's move on to the house. You refer to it as your house, but the deed is in the name of a holding company, Elara Design Ventures, LLC. I am the sole proprietor. You are not named on the deed, the mortgage, or the insurance. You have been for 8 years a guest who has repeatedly criticized the decor." Maria Reyes slid another document across the table. "Exhibit B, the deed and incorporation papers." Beatrice made a sputtering sound. "This is absurd. That house is their marital home." "A home implies a partnership, Beatrice," Pastor David said quietly. "Elara is outlining the terms of a business arrangement that your son has violated." Elara continued, her voice relentless. "The cars, the Mercedes you drive is leased. The lease is in my company's name. The lease payments are drawn from my accounts. The Range Rover your mother drives was a birthday gift. From me, a fact I allowed you to take credit for, Marcus, because your ego was fragile, and I still believed it was worth protecting." Beatrice looked as if she'd been struck. "The credit cards, the business trips to meet investors in Aspen and St. Bart's, the $5,000 suits, the $1,000 dinners, the jewelry for your mistress." She finally glanced at Chloe, whose face had gone chalk white. "All of it, every last cent, paid for by me, by the woman you called a drain, by the woman you found weighed down." She leaned forward. "I wasn't weighed down by life, Marcus. I was weighed down by you." The statement landed in the silent room with the force of a physical blow. The quiet bomb had detonated, and the fallout was just beginning to settle. The air in the fellowship hall was thick with the dust of a demolished reality. Marcus stared at Elara, his mouth slightly agape. The sneer was gone, replaced by a dawning, horrified comprehension. He was not a king in a temporary dispute with his queen. He was a jester who had just been informed that the castle, the crown, and the kingdom itself all belonged to the quiet woman he had spent years trying to humiliate. Mr. Jennings, the shark-like lawyer, was frantically shuffling through the documents Sterling and Reyes had provided. His confident smirk had been wiped clean, replaced by a sheen of sweat on his upper lip. He was a lawyer who specialized in bullying tactics and loud bluffs. He was utterly unprepared for a case built on a mountain of cold, hard, irrefutable facts. "This is highly irregular, Jennings stammered, looking at his client for guidance, but Marcus was a statue of disbelief. It is meticulously regular, Daniel Sterling countered, his voice dry as bone. Every transaction is documented. Every asset is firewalled. Forgive me, Ms. Vance, has been operating with a level of financial prudence that is, in my professional experience, breathtaking. Your client, on the other hand, has been operating under the delusion that his wife's fortune was a personal expense account. Ilara turned the page in her journal. The simple, methodical action was more intimidating than any shouting could have been. The final item on the list is Aurelian lifestyles, she said, her voice dropping slightly, drawing all focus back to her. My one and only true investment in you, Marcus. I believed in your dream, or at least, I wanted to. Over the past 5 years, I have funneled a total of $1.7 million into that company. A choked sound came from Beatrice. The number was beyond her comprehension. It has generated a net revenue of 0, Ilara continued, her voice flat. It is, by all metrics, a failed vanity project. However, the brand identity, the website, the office space, it's all intellectual and physical property that belongs to Aurelian Lifestyles, the corporation. She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. And I am the majority shareholder. She slid a final document from the back of her journal. It was a stock certificate. When the company was formed, you were so busy designing the logo and picking out office furniture that you didn't bother to read the incorporation documents I drew up with my lawyers. You were named CEO. I was named chairman of the board and retained 90% of the founding shares in exchange for providing all capital. You own 10% of a company that is $1.7 million in debt. To me. She folded her hands on top of her journal. The list was complete. So this is the situation. As of Monday morning, you have been legally removed from my house. The car lease will be terminated at the end of the month. All credit lines have been cut. And as of this meeting, as chairman of the board, I am informing you that your position as CEO of Aurelian Lifestyles is terminated, effective immediately, for gross mismanagement of funds and conduct detrimental to the brand's image. She finally looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she saw him not as her tormentor, but as what he was, a small, hollow man. You have nothing, Marcus. You have your 10% of a worthless company, the clothes on your back, and a hotel bill that's growing by the hour. You snatched a wig from my head in front of 200 people to feel powerful. This, she gestured to the pile of documents, to the shattered expressions around the table, is what real power looks like. It's not loud, it's not cruel, it's just thorough. Silence. Profound, absolute silence. Then the facade of Marcus's entire life cracked and fell away. His face crumpled. The arrogance, the belligerence, the smug superiority, it all dissolved into raw, pathetic panic. Ilara, no, he whispered, the words catching in his throat. You can't. He looked around the table, his eyes wild, seeking an ally. He looked at his mother, who was staring at her hands, her face a ruin of shock and shame. He looked at Chloe, who was inching her chair away from him as if he were contagious. He looked at his lawyer, who was discreetly packing his briefcase, recognizing a total loss. There was no one. He was utterly alone, adrift in the wreckage of a life he had never actually built. The aftermath in the fellowship hall was a slow-motion collapse. Marcus, stripped of his power and his delusions, finally broke. Please, Ilara, he begged, his voice cracking. He stood up and took a step toward her, his hands outstretched. It was a pathetic, desperate gesture. We can fix this. It's me. It's your husband. No, Ilara replied, her voice calm but unyielding. She didn't flinch or move back. You stopped being my husband a long time ago, Marcus. You became my burden, and I've decided to put you down. The words were brutal in their finality. There was no room for negotiation. Maria Reyes stood up. "I believe we are done here. Mr. Jennings, my office will be in touch with yours to arrange for your client to retrieve his personal effects from the residence. He will be given 1 hour, and he will be supervised." Beatrice finally found her voice, but it was not the imperious tone she was used to. It was thin and reedy, laced with disbelief. "Everything?" she whispered, looking at Alara. "The house? My car? It was all you?" Ilara met her mother-in-law's gaze. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a deep, abiding sadness for the waste of it all. "Yes, Beatrice, it was all me. The woman who was never good enough for your son was the only thing holding his world together." Beatrice seemed to shrink in her chair. The foundation of her own life, her pride in her son's supposed success, had been pulverized. Her condescension, her years of subtle and overt cruelty toward Alara, were suddenly cast in a new, hideous light. She had been mocking the very person who was funding her lifestyle, who had gifted her the car she drove so proudly. The humiliation was absolute. Chloe, seeing her opportunity, scrambled to her feet. "I had nothing to do with this," she declared, pointing a trembling finger at Marcus. "He lied to me. He told me he was a powerful man, that he was leaving his cold, frigid wife. He told me that house was his. He's a liar and a fraud." She looked at Alara, her eyes wide with a desperate plea for alliance. "I'm a victim here too." Ilara looked at the young woman, a mirror of the superficiality Marcus so admired, and felt a sliver of pity. "You chose to be a part of another woman's humiliation," she said softly, but with the cut of a razor. "You laughed. You accepted the gift. That makes you a participant, not a victim. Your association with Marcus is his problem now, not mine. I suggest you leave." Without another word, Chloe grabbed her purse and practically fled from the room, leaving the scent of her cheap perfume lingering in the air like a bad memory. Marcus watched her go, another piece of his fantasy life deserting him. He sank back into his chair, a completely broken man. "What am I supposed to do?" he mumbled to the polished surface of the table. "Where am I supposed to go?" This was the moment Ilara had both dreaded and prepared for, the moment when her victory could curdle into vindictiveness. She took a deep breath, anchoring herself in the principles she had built her life on. Justice, not revenge. Integrity, not cruelty. "That is no longer my concern," she said, her voice softening almost imperceptibly. "I have arranged for 1 month's rent to be paid on a modest apartment in the city. There will be enough money in a new bank account for basic living expenses for that month. After that, you are on your own. It is more than you deserve. It is more courtesy than you ever showed me. Consider it my final act of charity." She stood up, her team rising with her. "Pastor David, thank you for facilitating this." The pastor, who had watched the entire exchange with a grave expression, nodded slowly. "God's justice is not always gentle, but it is always true, Ilara. You have acted with honor." As Ilara and her team walked toward the door, Beatrice spoke one last time, her voice barely a whisper. "Wait." Ilara paused, her back to the room. "I'm sorry," Beatrice choked out. The words sounded foreign, painful. "I was wrong about everything." Ilara stood for a long moment, the sounds of the quiet room behind her. She thought of the years of slights, the dismissive looks, the cutting remarks. An apology now, at the bottom of the abyss, felt like too little, far too late. But it was, perhaps, a start. Without turning around, she gave a single, brief nod of acknowledgement. It was not forgiveness. It was not absolution. It was simply an ending. She then walked out the door and did not look back. The weeks that followed were a study in contrasts. For Ilara, it was a time of quiet expansion, like a lung taking a full, deep breath after years of being constricted. The cobalt blue suit she had worn to the meeting was not an anomaly. It was the new standard. She shed the muted, conservative wardrobe she had adopted to make herself smaller for Marcus, and embraced the vibrant, confident style that matched her spirit. She stopped wearing the wig, not out of defiance, but because she simply no longer cared what anyone thought of her hair. Her cropped, silver-streaked hair became a symbol of her freedom. Her work flourished. Freed from the emotional and financial drain of her marriage, she poured her energy into her firm. She accepted a prestigious commission to design a new National Museum of Art, a project that would cement her legacy as one of the most important architects of her generation. She moved out of the glass-walled house, which held too many ghosts, and sold it. The proceeds were donated in their entirety to fund a network of women's shelters, a project she now personally oversaw through a foundation she established. She moved into a beautiful, light-filled apartment in the heart of the city, a space that was entirely her own. Pastor David became a true friend. They would meet for coffee, their conversations ranging from theology to urban planning. He marveled at her resilience and grace. "You never became bitter, Alara," he said one afternoon, as they sat in a sun-drenched cafe. "After all you endured, you chose creation over destruction." "Bitterness is a prison, Pastor," she replied, stirring her tea. "Marcus built his own prison of arrogance and deceit. I was just a visitor there for a while. I have no intention of building one for myself." For Marcus and Beatrice, the weeks were a steep, brutal descent. The month of prepaid rent and living expenses ran out. Marcus, stripped of his charm and his wife's money, found that the world was not as enamored with him as he had believed. His network of friends evaporated. Mr. Harrison, the developer, wouldn't even take his calls. With no resume and no skills beyond self-promotion, he couldn't find a job. He tried to sue Alara, but Mr. Jennings informed him he had no case and dropped him as a client when he couldn't pay his retainer. He and Beatrice were forced to move out of the modest apartment and into a cramped, dingy room in a boarding house on the far side of the city. The shame was a constant, suffocating blanket. Beatrice, who had once lorded her status over Alara, now had to take a job as a cashier in a supermarket to make ends meet. The expensive clothes were sold for a fraction of their worth. The Range Rover was repossessed. Her hands, once perfectly manicured, became chapped and red from work. One evening, Alara was leaving a late meeting at the construction site for the pediatric facility. As her car stopped at a red light, she glanced out the window. She saw Marcus. He was working as a valet at a high-end restaurant, the very kind of place he used to frequent. He was wearing an ill-fitting red jacket and a strained, humiliatingly servile expression as he opened the door of a luxury car for a wealthy couple. Their eyes met for a fleeting second across the rain-slicked street. She saw a flicker of shame, of anger, of pathetic longing in his eyes. He quickly looked away, his face burning. Alara felt nothing. No pity, no satisfaction, no anger. It was like looking at a stranger. The light turned green and she drove on, her mind already on the blueprints for the next day. He was a part of her past, a demolished structure she had long since cleared away to build something better. His poetic justice was not her victory. Her victory was that his fate no longer mattered to her at all. The final pieces of the old life fell away quietly. The divorce was finalized without contest. Marcus, on the advice of a court-appointed lawyer, signed everything without a fight. He had nothing left to bargain with. One Sunday, months later, Beatrice showed up at Grace Chapel. She didn't wear her old finery, but a simple, clean dress. She sat in the very back pew, her head bowed. She stayed for the whole service and left without speaking to anyone. She came back the next week, and the week after that. She started volunteering in the church's soup kitchen, scrubbing pots and serving meals with a quiet humility that was utterly foreign to the woman she had once been. She never tried to speak to Alara, who still attended service every week, sitting in her usual spot. But sometimes, from across the room, their eyes would meet. And in Beatrice's gaze, there was a profound, unspoken repentance. Redemption, Alara knew, was a long, slow process of rebuilding, and Beatrice, in her own quiet way, had finally begun to lay a new foundation. The pediatric care facility opened on a bright, crisp autumn day, 1 year after the incident at the church. It was a masterpiece of light and color, a building that felt less like a hospital and more like a place of hope. Ilara stood on the podium, addressing the crowd of city officials, donors, and grateful parents. She was radiant, her face full of life and purpose. "Buildings are more than just structures of steel and glass," she said, her voice carrying over the crowd. "They are containers for our lives, our hopes, our communities. They can be prisons, or they can be sanctuaries. The choice is not in the materials we use, but in the integrity with which we build." As she spoke, she saw Pastor David in the front row, beaming. Nearby, she saw a woman she didn't recognize, who then turned and smiled. It was Beatrice. She looked older, her face lined with the hardship of the past year, but her eyes were clear. She was not there as a VIP, but as a member of the community, standing in the back, listening. She applauded with genuine warmth when Ilara finished her speech. Later, as Ilara was greeting well-wishers, Beatrice approached her hesitantly. "It's beautiful, Ilara," she said, her voice soft. "What you've built." "Thank you, Beatrice," Ilara replied, her tone kind. There was no lingering animosity. I work at the supermarket down the street now," Beatrice said, a faint, embarrassed flush on her cheeks. "I see the mothers taking their children here. It's a good thing, a really good thing." She wrung her hands. "I never understood what you did. I never understood you. I am so sorry." This time, the apology felt real. It was not a desperate plea from the bottom of a pit, but a quiet statement of truth from a woman who had been humbled and perhaps changed. "I know," Ilara said gently, and in that moment she finally let go of the last ghost. She offered Beatrice a small, genuine smile. "Take care of yourself." As Beatrice walked away, blending back into the crowd, Ilara felt a profound sense of peace. Justice had been served, but more importantly, grace had found a way to enter. Her life was her own creation now, built on a foundation of self-respect, integrity, and an unshakable belief in her own worth. The past was a blueprint of lessons learned, but the future was an open vista waiting for her to design it. And it was going to be magnificent. True strength isn't about how loudly you can shout, but how patiently you can build. It's about knowing your own value, even when others try to devalue you. Ilara's story is a powerful reminder that dignity is not something that can be taken from you. It can only be surrendered. She held on to hers in the face of profound disrespect, and in the end, it was her greatest shield and her sharpest weapon. She didn't seek revenge, she sought restoration, and in rebuilding her own life, she created something beautiful and lasting. What do you think is the most important lesson from Ilara's journey? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We read every single one. And if this story resonated with you, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more stories of quiet strength and ultimate vindication. Thank you for watching, and remember, build your life on a foundation so strong that no storm can ever tear it down.